Well, thank you very much. It's really good to be here and nice to see so many familiar faces in this room. I'm especially pleased to have the opportunity to talk to you tonight about waterways, because rivers have been such an important part of my life. And I've been an avid paddler and a fisherman ever since I was a young boy. And in that capacity, I've been very fortunate to have traveled along many of the world's great rivers, which are the arteries of our planet. Yet, while our waterways continue to play such a vital role, they also continue to face an array of threats, not just in Canada or the US, but in every country I've visited. Threats that range from pollution and urbanization to the excessive extraction of water and the building of dams. Without question, these are issues of concern along many of the world's waterways. And certainly the filming we've done the past 2 years on rivers around the world has reinforced that. Whether it be the Pearl River in southern China, which has been so hard hit by the textile manufacturing sector, at times causing its waters to literally run black. We filmed that just 2 weeks ago. It was amazing to see. Or India's Yamuna River, or the Ganges, which continue to be plagued by sewage and industrial effluent. And in Chile, Ethiopia, and elsewhere, I've traveled on rivers where major issues were unfolding around the building of large dams. And while dams can provide benefits, and they can contribute to development, there are also many examples where their environmental and social costs have exceeded those benefits. And where that's the case, we haven't always done a good job of anticipating that. And all of this is further complicated by the fact that rivers are really difficult features to manage and protect at the best of times, in that they're long and linear and they usually cross an array of environments and jurisdictions. So protecting them is a challenge. It's not easy. But that said, I think we can and must do more. But while many of our rivers are troubled, and without question, there is still much to do, it's also important to note that we have made progress on some fronts. And part of the reason for that is that we've seen a significant increase in public awareness in terms of both the importance of our waterways as well as the kinds of threats that they face. And that increased awareness has been reflected by the dramatic growth that we've seen in events like World Rivers Day. World Rivers Day is an event that has its roots right here in British Columbia, going back to 1980, when we organized a single cleanup on the Thompson River. Afterwards, we all met in the local pub, great place to get together after a day on the river. And we decided that it was such a worthy event and so much fun that we'd organize a few more events the following year, and then a few more the year after that. We then started to engage all levels of government, and the event soon took on a life of its own, quickly growing to involve more than 75,000 people in BC alone. Then in 2004, we approached the UN about the idea of a World Rivers Day celebration to go along with their Water for Life Decade initiative that would run from 2005 to 2015. We got their blessing, and then we started this massive, major outreach effort to river-related groups around the world. And the reaction, I'm pleased to say, has been encouraging. It's been amazing. And in just the past 8 years, World Rivers Day has grown to involve more than 60 countries and literally millions of people in events ranging from stream cleanups and habitat enhancement projects to educational outings and community riverside celebrations. Now, in terms of my own background, rivers have been a big part of my life. And as I look back over the last 5 decades, there are a number of key events and experiences that certainly had an influence on me. In addition, as you can probably tell, I am a great believer in river travel, which is a wonderful way to see a country and its people. And in much of the world, day-to-day life still revolves around nearby waterways. So I'm always hopeful that gatherings like this one will encourage others to spend even more time on and along rivers, whether that be here at home or abroad. Now, over the next few minutes, I'd like to touch on some of my own personal river experiences. But most importantly, I'd like to talk about some examples of rivers that have been lost, saved, and restored, and what we might learn from that. As I mentioned a little earlier, I've had an interest in rivers and water for a long, long time. And some of that goes back to my childhood years in Los Angeles. A fun place to grow up in the 50s. But LA was a sprawling city and a very dry one. I also lived close to the Los Angeles River that borders Griffith Park, a waterway that had been totally encased in a giant concrete ditch. Everything about the river had been altered and changed. Some of you would have done the LA tourism thing, I'm sure have seen this. As a young boy, though, I used to hang out there, and it was a great place to ride my bike because it was more or less an early version of those half-pipe skateboarding parks you see now. We were ahead of our time. But I didn't have to be very old before I realized that as a river, this is not how it was meant to be. Now, there's always been something about moving water that has captivated me. And as I got a little older, I found myself literally drawn to rivers. I became an avid fly fisher, a rafter, a kayaker, a canoeist. And I came to believe that traveling a kilometer downriver in a raft could take you further from home than driving 100 kilometers in a car. And as a young guy without a vehicle, that was pretty appealing. So I began exploring rivers everywhere I could with family and friends. This is myself and my wife long ago. We had many great adventures. And part of the appeal of those early trips was literally being on the edge. Literally on the edge. But as a young man, I quickly grew beyond the adventure and whitewater focus, and I began to appreciate rivers in a broader way for the many values they possess. And ultimately, I came to see them as lifelines in the truest sense. So my own personal journey brought me to Vancouver in the early 70s. And I was excited about moving to this great city. But I also knew from my trips here as a boy that BC was a land of great rivers. And I embraced the idea of living near the Fraser River, one of the world's great waterways. And many of the delegates, I understand, you were actually on the river today, and what a beautiful day to be on the river. And for those visitors from out of our country, just so you know, this amazing river is literally the heart and soul of our province, without question. Elsewhere in British Columbia, we have many other incredible waterways. The Adams, with its legendary sockeye salmon run, being just one of them. And rivers like the Adams, the Fraser, and so many others add greatly to the quality of life that British Columbians enjoy. Now, when you talk about rivers, water is certainly the source of our pleasure. And going back to my youth, I remember being captivated by these early photos from space of our amazing blue planet. My dad was in the aerospace industry, and he'd bring me home photos like this, and I'd be totally amazed. But while much of the earth is covered with water, this is a deceiving image, in that far less than 1% of that water is fresh, clean, and accessible. And properly caring for the limited amount of available fresh water, I believe, is our planet's most pressing environmental challenge. Even in BC, where we're blessed with a relative abundance compared to elsewhere, and I say relative, the water we have is not evenly distributed. And there are parts of our province, such as the Okanagan, where we're already seeing signs of water stress, where demand exceeds supply. And some of my favorite rivers in the interior, such as the Kettle, almost run dry in the summer because of excessive water withdrawals. And just to quickly add, I think the situation on the Kettle really highlights the need to modernize BC's Water Act, which is a century old and which currently makes no reference to the need to protect fish or aquatic ecosystems when approving water withdrawals from rivers. So certainly that's an area where we can do better. Elsewhere in the world, many renowned waterways, such as the Colorado, the Rio Grande, China's Yellow River, which I saw not long ago, even the Nile, can run dry before ever reaching the sea. And in countries such as Australia, where I've spent much time and where my mother was born, they've had their own experiences with drought, which in turn had a major impact on waterways. So this is an issue we should all care about, regardless of where we live. Simply because, after all, we are all citizens of the planet. I think that's a really important note to make. It's really important to act locally and think globally, to look at ourselves as citizens of the planet. History is also littered with references to water shortages that had a profound effect on local cultures. The great Mayan Empire is one such example. And my daughter Kelly, who's with us tonight, my daughter Kelly and I found some evidence of that a decade ago when we were given the chance to explore an underground stream running through an ancient Mayan cave, the inside of which was littered with the skeletal remains of victims that were sacrificed to the rain god 1,000 years ago in the hope of ending a major drought. But for decades, those rains never came. And drought and famine ultimately led to the breakdown of the Mayan Empire, epitomizing the fact that, however great a civilization may be, we are all dependent on water. And then, flashing forward to present-day Africa, we're seeing a water crisis that is becoming only more severe in the face of climate change. And while this is impacting rivers, it's also creating a host of other serious social ills. And just to digress a moment, that's why I'm so supportive of the work of charitable groups like WaterCan. And their effort to install and develop water wells is making a huge difference to the health and well-being of communities. And I do hope that improved access to clean, fresh water across much of Africa will be humanity's next great step forward. Now, during my years as a river advocate, I've experienced the joy of seeing some of our great rivers protected. One of those was the Tachinshini, a river in BC's northwest that was formerly protected from a controversial mining development in 1993. It's one of my favorite waterways and one of the world's great river experiences. And as you paddle past its glaciers, you feel pretty small. It humbles you. And there are many other inspiring examples. Among those are rivers like the Pequari in Costa Rica, where the government ruled against a large dam proposal, choosing to focus instead on protecting environmental and tourism-related values. My daughter Lindsay and I took an amazing celebratory trip down that river shortly after that decision. Similarly, in the mid-90s, I spent quite a bit of time in Nepal's Arun Valley, where farmers were fighting to protect their river and their lands in the face of a massive dam proposal. While there, I also witnessed perhaps the very first major environmental demonstration of its kind in Kathmandu, centering on the need to protect the Arun. And after that, international support for these locals took off to the point where the International Monetary Fund withdrew its funding for the development. And as a result, government opted to forego the project, choosing instead to focus on smaller, locally based power projects. And then, with my Australian roots, you have the globally significant decision to protect the Franklin in Tasmania, one of the great river conservation success stories. On the flip side, I've also seen my share of rivers that are dying. One such example is Indonesia's Citarum River, one of the most polluted waterways in the world, a river we filmed on only 10 days ago. And one of the more dire sights that I've ever seen is the massive amount of garbage that literally chokes this river. In places, the debris runs from bank to bank. It's literally a carpet of refuse. And with so little life left in the river, fishermen now forage through the rubbish in the hope of salvaging anything that they can sell or trade. And to see any river come to this is dispiriting. Still another waterway on the brink, and another one that we filmed on, is India's Yamuna River. And what looks like ice floating on the surface is actually a toxic industrial froth. Pollution events like this, once again thinking of all of us being citizens of the planet, pollution events like this should be a concern to all of us. Because if a major river system like the Yamuna or the Ganges were to die, there would be huge ripple effects because everything is interconnected. Not only would India's environment become more impoverished, but the planet's environment would be diminished as well. In a similar vein, I have seen other rivers close to my heart that have been lost. One of those was the Biobío in Chile, once known as the world's premier whitewater river. In fact, I participated in probably the very last raft trip along this stretch. But that was just prior to the completion of the Pangué Dam, an impoundment that would forcefully displace many indigenous Puenche people. While there, I also came to know Maria Pinello, a Puenche elder who was a great spokesperson for her people. And she vowed not to let the graves of her ancestors be covered with water. She was an incredible woman, one of the most amazing women I've ever met. But her pleas went unanswered. The dams would be built. Now, rivers can be impacted by many different things. Some are hit by pollution and excessive water extraction, while others are threatened by things like urbanization or industrial development. And looking at the latter, a nearby example is our own Heart of the Fraser, located between the towns of Hope and Mission, and one of the most productive stretches of river anywhere in the world. An amazing stretch of river. But given its proximity to Vancouver, many key habitats along this stretch are threatened by development pressures. Yet, there is still time to save this part of the river if we act soon. And putting together a collaborative plan, a management plan, would do wonders. I think everybody from all parties at all levels think that's an admirable thing to do. So I hope we find a way to get there, because I do think it's doable and it's so important. I also believe the Experience the Fraser Trail initiative that you've heard a little bit about during the conference. It's an initiative being led by Metro Vancouver and the Fraser Valley Regional District. Not only is that a great undertaking unto itself, but it will also do much to increase public awareness by exposing so many more people to the wonders of this part of the river. And after my presentation, I think we're going to have time for just a few questions from some of the delegates, but I hope that's an area we can discuss a little bit more. Still on the theme of rivers that may be lost, we'll quickly move to Eastern Africa. Now, when you come right down to it, water and life are one and the same. And to me, that was especially evident in a remote part of Ethiopia, a place known as the Omo Valley, perhaps the most culturally intact landscape in all of Africa. It's a valley that's inhabited by several amazing tribal groups who continue to pursue a very traditional lifestyle. One of those is the Karo people, one of Africa's most endangered indigenous groups. Like other indigenous groups in the valley, the Karo determine their wealth by the number of cattle they possess. But their sustenance depends on the practice of flood retreat agriculture. This type of farming depends on the natural rhythms of the Omo River. In other words, after seasonal flooding, the river retreats, depositing a layer of fine silt along the river's edge. That makes the strip of land adjacent to the river incredibly productive. So it's immediately planted with corn and beans and maize. Yet this will all soon change, perhaps as early as next year, with the completion of a huge upstream dam that will release water in a very stable way, eliminating the viability of flood retreat farming. To date, the Karo, unfortunately, have had little say in the matter. And in the absence of major mitigation efforts, they face a very uncertain future. As the chief of the Caro said to me, if they take our water, they take our life. Now, over my career, I've had the excitement, the privilege of seeing the restoration of some streams that were once severely damaged. And to see a river come back to life is an inspiring thing. One such example is Gishon Creek, a small urban stream that flows through the BCIT campus in Burnaby. 50 years ago, this waterway was ravaged and converted into an almost lifeless drainage ditch. And yet, thanks to BCIT, its Fish and Wildlife Program, the Rivers Institute, and many, many others, this stream has been revived. Water quality improved, fish habitat enhanced, creekside vegetation restored. And the creek once again supports a healthy fishery. So the lesson from Gishon Creek is that we should never give up on any river. Similarly, in recent years, I've been going back to the Milltown Dam site just outside of Missoula, Montana. Now, I don't know if we have any Montana delegates here, but this is a particular issue that's close to my heart. Located at the confluence of the Blackfoot and Clark Fork rivers, this is close to where I lived long ago, very long ago, as a university student. And back then, the reservoir behind this dam was widely known as one of the most toxic sites in the United States due to the accumulation of heavy metals and residue from an upstream mine. And as a young paddler and fisherman, I remember hoping that one day, maybe one day, this might be cleaned up. So I have watched with great joy the last few years as a major cleanup finally did take place. Toxic sediments were removed, the dam was dismantled, the river now runs free. And unlike when I was young, I can now paddle right through the confluence. There's also a new state park that's established on both sides of the river, and this area will green up dramatically in the next few years. And this site, once so damaged and once so poisonous, is becoming a popular recreation destination. Examples like this give us hope and make me smile, and highlight the fact that if there's a will, then yes, we can in fact turn things around. So in closing, if you had to sum up where we are, while there have been some recent gains, there is still much to be done in terms of protecting healthy rivers while trying to repair those that have been damaged in past. And a number of our rivers clearly do remain under siege. So the next time any of you visit a river, whether it be as a fisher, or perhaps to view some of the great wildlife spectacles along our rivers, be it caribou along the Firth, or grizzlies along some of Kamchatka's spectacular waterways. I love this photo. Or the spectacle of a wildebeest crossing on Kenya's Mara River. Or maybe the next time you raft a river, and as you can see, I'm a lot younger here. Or if you choose to pursue a more extreme river activity. Whatever one does, I think it's important for all of us to try and look at rivers in a different way and from a different perspective. First, we have to take a broader view and recognize that the kinds of threats facing rivers are changing. They're becoming more subtle, more complex. So we have to know why it's important to protect things like in-stream flows and streamside vegetation. And as much as possible, we should look at rivers as ecosystems and do our best to properly manage not only the river, but also the land that it drains. Secondly, we have to continue to encourage local grassroots advocacy work, ranging from stream keeper initiatives to adopt a stream programs. Because the bottom line is that local populations are usually in the best position to protect and care for many of our waterways. And the level of involvement by local groups that we're seeing in events like World Rivers Day is certainly encouraging. Thirdly, While recognizing that the conservation and protection of waterways will remain a major part of our efforts, but in addition to that, river restoration will become an increasingly significant part of our work as well. One such example is BC's Britannia Creek, once a notorious toxic hotspot as a result of acid runoff from this now defunct century-old copper mine. As a result, the creek became totally devoid of all life. No vegetation, no insects, no fish, no life, period. But thanks to the efforts of many, this waterway has been revived. And in 2011, for the first time in a century, we saw salmon return to these waters. That was certainly exciting and so encouraging. Finally, we have to take a longer-term view of what we are going to leave for future generations. And the sound management of our fish stocks is certainly part of that equation, no question. But it also means protecting habitat and ensuring that our children and theirs, this being my grandson, will be able to enjoy rivers in the very same way that we have. And if that guides our thinking, our rivers will have a future. Thank you very much.
Yeah.